Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts. Howdy, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this Sports Psych Concepts lecture recording. Today, the topic is an important one that I think a lot of coaches and different practitioners exert a lot of time and effort in trying to implement with their athletes or performers, and that's simply how to foster motivation in athletes. So this is more of an applied presentation. I want to talk about specific strategies and tips. There's one particular theory that I'll include here just because I think there's the theory lines up really nicely with the application, and so I'll bring that one in, but really just want to focus on motivation building strategies and how to foster motivation in athletes. So I want to start out like I sometimes do by asking you to ponder a question, right? And it's looking back in time and just thinking about something that maybe you've done. It could have been a class that you took at some point, you signed up for, just anything that you did that maybe you signed up for and you really didn't think that you were going to like it going into it. Just the motivation wasn't really high, but then you got there and you got through it and you ended up liking it, right? You liked it a lot, you enjoyed it, you were motivated to do it, and kind of bummed that it ended. So I'm imagining different examples come to mind for you. I know it does for me, but what was it that happened in that instance, in that experience that you had where how you felt going in, and it was not super positive about this situation? Motivation was low, but then by the end it was high. Like, what was it that happened? Okay, and I want you to consider both situations and traits, right? Was there something that you brought to the situation, some sort of personal trait factor thing, or just personal factor bound up in yourself, or were there certain things in the situation? And then to follow up on that, I want to think, because this is the interaction model, right? How do we use these things? But then I want to ask this question along with this, right? Before I provide a little bit more commentary, but which one of those things do we have more control over? If we're a coach, we're a trainer, we're some sort of practitioner, we're working in the applied space, working with these athletes, what do we have control over? Do we have control over the traits? Do we have control over the situation? Now, it's interesting to think about this, and at least I think it is, and here's why. Because coaches in their eminently influential position that they have with athletes, they usually attribute poor motivation to some sort of personality characteristic, right? When an unmotivated athlete shows up, the coaches say, well, she just doesn't want it bad enough, or this team just doesn't care about getting better, right? They say it's just some sort of trait that's there. And so this view alone, it fails to consider the situational factors that the coaches themselves can greatly influence. Okay, whereas other coaches, they only consider the environment. So if you have to play in a crappy gym or venue all the time, then we put all the blame on the environment. We say that's what it is that's going on, and maybe there's not these other things. Okay, and so I'm sharing all of this because as you thought of that example, there probably was something about the motivational climate in that space that changed it for you. So yes, there's an interaction of these different things. Some coaches or practitioners may overemphasize one or the other, but in the modern sports psychology space, there's this emphasis on the motivational climate, because this certainly is a lot easier to manipulate than a person's individual needs or their personality, although we can help them meet some of their needs, we can certainly help with that within, especially if we're coaches, if we're working in within that role. Okay, but this is the backdrop for what I'm talking about is how do we create a sort of a mastery climate, a motive as a core motivation building strategy. So think back on those experiences that you've had and what it was that went on, and carry that with you through the remainder of this presentation as I ask you to ponder a few more questions. And one of those questions is, of course, the why, right? I refer to this quite often when working with athletes and talking about sports psychology in general, but what is your why? Why do you participate in your sport, your exercise, your activity? What is it? And whatever it is that we're doing, what is the core reason? And we can ask that enough times. I know there's different philosophical you sort of approaches for asking the why, and you keep going, and eventually you get to this core reason at the bottom, and it's kind of like that, right? But that's what I'm getting at here is we have to actually ask ourselves that question sometimes, and sometimes we ask it more than once. It's like, oh well, because of this. Well, why is that important to you? Why is this? And eventually you do that enough times, you get down to the core motivation, and that by itself can be a very motivating force for athletes because it's reconnecting with their anchor point. They're staying grounded in their why, and the why that is the most important why. Okay, so just for example on this, a lot of athletes in college, they get to a higher level, there's higher stakes, there's just more going on, training is more stringent, it's more absorbing of their life, and they have all these other responsibilities going on as they're maturing as young adults and taking on more responsibility. And the why can get lost in that. Maybe they started because they genuinely love the sport. They love to compete. It provides fulfillment on its own. There's intrinsic motivation. But then it gets replaced by all these other reasons that are legitimate reasons. I got to do because coach says you got to be there at that time, you got to meet all these other obligations, these different things, and there's these layers of why on top of that anchor why, and they lose connection with that. And so this by itself, just asking this simple question, can be a powerful strategy. Now, as I said, we all are going to have multiple reasons. Some will be common, others will be unique things. Okay, but I want to introduce the theory that I alluded to at the beginning, and that is self-determination theory. This is my favorite theory of motivation. It's certainly widespread in the sports psych space and is used and discussed in the literature and uh, both the scholarly literature and the gray literature and just general literature out there and media. So self-determination theory, I'm just going to give you sort of a basic rundown with this, but this ties into this why thing here a little bit. And there's three basic needs, okay, just basic psychological needs that need to be met in order for our motivation to be considered self-determined motivation. Okay, so the first is competence, just believing in our ability to do something, to perform a particular task, to perform well in our sport. We just have this feeling of competence. Autonomy is the second piece. So just having this sense of control or choice in what it is that we do or what it is that happens in our lives, that's having that a sense of autonomy, or what's going on within our training or practicing. And then relatedness is that social connection and belonging with other people, with our teammates, with our coaches, having all those things. Okay, so in order for our motivation to be considered self-determined motivation, all of these three needs need to be met in sufficient capacity. And if we're lacking in any of them, particularly autonomy is seems to be especially salient here, but if we're lacking in them, then that will affect our motivation. Okay, and you can think of all sorts of different examples of what that could look like in different permutations of that. Okay, but what this has led to is a full spectrum or range of motivations here. Okay, and ranging from a motivation on one end where someone may just be going through the motions, they don't really care, they don't feel competent, and there's just not really any motivation there, but they may even still be going through the emotions. Whereas, and then we have this range of extrinsic motivation in the middle, which goes all the way to intrinsic motivation on the other end. So intrinsic motivation, just to give you the end caps on this, is we're doing something for the sake of doing it, to where doing it is satisfying, fulfilling. We get this sort of intellectual stimulation or this sense of accomplishment. We learn new things and increase our knowledge. All those things are intrinsically motivating just for the sake of doing them themselves. Okay. And certain activities can be that way. So things that are fun are intrinsically motivating just for the sake of doing it. Right. So then we have extrinsic motivation, and there's different categories of this. So you have external regulation is the first, where our behavior, basically it's completely controlled externally. I'm doing this to get some sort of reward, right? Or avoid some sort of punishment, perhaps. Then it can move to introjected regulation, where we feel some sort of internal prods or pressures to do something, like I'm doing this sport to impress my dad, or maybe I'm eating salad because I heard that it's good for me somewhere, right? There's some sort of internal prodding for that. It's not just to get some outward thing, right? But it's still extrinsic motivation. Then there's this threshold of autonomy in the middle, where it becomes more autonomous from this point forward, moving toward intrinsic motivation. Okay, so it just becomes there's more choice in the matter. So moving, instead of where, well, I ought to do this, now it's like, well, I want to do this. So that's identified regulation, where the behavior itself is highly valued or accepted by the athlete, and it's performed willingly, even if the activity itself isn't enjoyable. Okay, so it's like, I think about running on a treadmill for a cross country athlete or something like that, right? The doing it is valued, it's important to them, but it's like running on a treadmill is not necessarily all that stimulating by itself. Okay, but then we can move to integrated regulation, where the activity becomes personally important because of some valued outcome. So rather than just like the intrinsic value of the activity itself. So think of athletes who do conditioning. Okay, they identify with that not because they love the conditioning themselves, but they love their sport and they want to do the best that they can at their sport. And so they've identified with that value, and so they've integrated that activity because it ties directly into that other thing that they value and helps them achieve their goals. Okay, so with this, I'm going to ask you those different examples from earlier. You think about, I mean, it's like, why do you participate in your sport, exercise, activity? We could look at different particular activities and we could lay them all out on this continuum. And every athlete, it's because I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood on this, because like, oh, well, we need to have intrinsic motivation. It's like, well, I mean, like, yeah, intrinsic motivation is great because it's sustainable, but some things are just like not necessarily all that enjoyable for everybody. But if we identify the doing the thing is important and it's tied to some value, or it's really helping me achieve some other goal, then that's past the threshold of autonomy. It's still more a higher level of self-determination than some of the other things. Okay, so even top level athletes, everything they do isn't driven by intrinsic motivation. There's levels of extrinsic motivation with those things, and they do those. It's just figuring out how to move beyond the threshold of autonomy for the things that really matter and are going to contribute to their success. So the application with this, and I've talked about this quite a bit so far, is we want to make sure that our athletes' three basic needs are being met. Okay, so how can we support their competence? How can we support their autonomy? How can we support their relatedness? What are different things that we can do to help them have those higher levels of self-determined motivation? Okay, and there's all sorts of different answers and ways we can go about that. And the key is to individualize it to the athlete and have that awareness first, because once we have that awareness, we really can take it quite a ways down the road. All right, so with self-determination theory now in the rear view window, I want to share a few tips on helping athletes find the why, like what I was talking about before, or just helping us understand what it is. So the first thing is just to observe, right? Pay attention. What's the intensity and direction of their effort? How are they going about the different things that they're doing? What is it that we are seeing in the context of self-determination theory? On what is their body language saying about their competence, for example, or their relatedness? Can we get any sort of feedback with that? Or let's take the advantage or the example of an injured athlete. Really struggle with these things. Competence is just diminished, obliterated in an instant, right? Their competence and their ability to do their sport is drawn away. The autonomy goes down in the swirly part of the toilet because they're just having to do rehab and go here and do all these things that everybody tells them to do. They don't really have much control over that. Don't feel like they have any choice. And then their relatedness are pulled away from the team. They're in the training room. They're in an ice bucket. They're doing all these different things. And so we should pay attention to those things and be very intentional about trying to help those athletes feel like those needs are being met. And by observing through that lens, that can be really a helpful way to go on understanding what their why is. Okay, but then also just talking to others who know the athletes or the clients. So if you're working with minor athletes, you can talk with their parents and their coaches. That can give you some information. We don't want to. We want to make sure that we're as objective as possible when we do talk to the athlete, because sometimes the coaches and the parents don't have the full story. Okay, and so in those instances, we can ask the athletes to tell us their reasons. Like, what's the deal here? We go through that succession of asking the question why and try to really get to the bottom here. Okay, so this is just really important because you're trying to establish the anchor. It's like a foundational sort of intervention, and then you can come up with some sort of, like in terms of applied sports psychology, come up with some sort of symbolism for it, some sort of anchor word or other thing, or art or AI created image or whatever, different things like that to help anchor that and symbolize it. And then a couple other things to consider on this, right? So gender differences, it's not a universal thing, but boys tend to be motivated more for the competitive side of things. Girls, it's more on collaboration, but obviously there's overlap between those things, but there does seem to be some general gender differences there, and so that can be helpful going in. Although, again, you consider every individual athlete and you don't let that guide everything that we're doing, because we don't want to go in with a stereotype mindset on that. But then there's also cultural differences, right? If you're working in a college athletic department, for example, you're going to have athletes from all sorts of different cultures just within the United States, if that's where you end up. But even still, you're going to have athletes from other countries, the international athletes, who may have different. Well, I mean, almost always, yeah, you're coming from different places. You're going to have different cultural perspectives and things that might drive the motivation. Why is it they're there? There may be higher stakes, just different kind of stakes, a way that we look at that. And so it's important to recognize those things and factor that in when we're trying to discover or help athletes discover their why. Now, I've mentioned this at other times. This climate, right? This mastery climate is the idea, but just creating the type of climate that is helps foster motivation. So I'm looking at coaches in a big way with this, but we can even do this. Like if I think about mental performance consultants, we can create a particular climate in the space when we meet with athletes, or even when we have the floor to talk to the whole team with athletes. We can create a particular climate that fosters that motivation for them to want to be there and to engage with us and what it is that we are doing. Okay, so a couple of ideas here on this, on how we create that climate. Okay, we need to provide, especially if you're working, let's say, high school athletes, right? I remember coaching a JV high school tennis team where we had the whole range of athletes who were interested in competition, and some were just interested for social reasons or exercise or recreation, just to have fun. And not everyone you work with cares as much about the competition. So we need to make space for everyone to get what they need. If again, if we're coaches here, this is what I'm speaking. Like, don't get frustrated by those athletes on the JV team that don't really care about competition. They just want something to do to have a good time and learn a new skill, and they're intrinsically motivated to that. And then you try and put these other things on them, and they don't care, right? So again, that JV high school team that I coached, I had 80 players on the team, and we'd play matches, and only 20 of them would show up for matches. The other ones didn't even care about that, right? And that was hard for me to understand at the time because I was all into the competition. That was a big thing that was important to me as a former athlete and then as a coach. And I had a lot of players that didn't care, and that was very, very good for me to see that and learn from that. So we need to create a climate that accounts for both of those situations when possible as coaches and practitioners. It's also good to provide multiple different types of opportunities. Okay, so think about this. Just look at elite athletes. Do they really want to train hard all the time? Or do they need opportunities for fun too? Right? So don't ignore the fun factor at every level. And again, yeah, they're going to have a much higher tolerance to train hard all the time. I'm not saying like just don't take it serious and all those sorts of things, but just recognizing that multiple opportunities to engage and stay connected with the different types of motivations that they have in what they're doing. Okay, and then we need to individualize our coaching or training of the types of things that we're doing. So the strongest example that I have on this is I once coached a college athlete who when I was coaching, I was not a yeller and a screamer. It wasn't the approach that I took. I was definitely more relational, positive, supportive, encouraging was the type of approach. And I really struggled with this one athlete. And one day he said, "Just coach, I think it would really help if you yelled at me." and and I remember doing just that, like being just taken aback. What? It was a surprise for me, and so I raised the volume a little bit with that particular athlete, and that worked for him. That's what it was that he needed, what he wanted. He needed that energy, that intensity coming from his coach. And so I had to adjust to him because I had other athletes that I would have crushed them if I used that approach with them. And so we need to recognize that some can, they need more positive reinforcement. Some maybe they can be more of a whipping boy, and they can take those things and they like that, and it doesn't really affect their motivation as much in a downward direction as maybe we would expect. So something to keep in mind as we try to create that climate. And then lastly, a few more tips for coaches specifically on this. I know I've tailored much of it in that direction, but I've talked to a lot of coaches over the years, and many of them will say like this is your job. Like you say, what is coaching? What is it you do? It's like I motivate athletes. That is what it is that I do. Okay, and I've had others, they say, well, I'm a teacher and all those sorts of things, but this is a core theme that I hear from a lot of coaches is to motivate, right? And you can reframe that into the terminology that I've been sharing today is you motivating them, or you're just creating the climate where their internal motivations can thrive and come out. Okay, it's one way to think about it. But the actions and inactions the coaches take, it has influence on the motivational environment. So you come in, you're going to be quiet, you're going to have distance from the athletes. I've seen coaches do this before where they just don't really talk, they don't really interact much. I've seen it where maybe the head coach is that way, the assistant coach will interact more and have more of a connection, the head coach is off to the side, more observing, those sorts of things, right? All of that has an influence on the motivational climate. And so it's important to be aware of it. So athletes don't misinterpret what it is you're trying to do, because you may think that you're having a particular effect, or that's your particular style or your approach and how you're going that. If they don't know what your intentions are, then they can misinterpret it. They don't know, and then it can create that environment that is actually the opposite of what you are intending or are hoping for. And then lastly, use variety, right? Because it can get really stale if you're just going into the exact same thing every time. And it doesn't mean that there isn't room for that, right? There is some monotony in training and performance and just drills and building habits and doing things repeatedly. There's absolutely a necessity for that. Okay, so it's trying to find ways that maybe you can infuse some variety or some novelty in things that are interesting and stimulating, and feed that motivation. Okay, and then use technology. I think about I was asked about this more recently from a colleague about using technology in the exercise psychology space as a tool over there, and absolutely there's potential for that, and using technology as a way to review or evaluate how athletes are performing, and slow motion replay and analyzing their movements and their techniques and all those sorts of things. Those things are cool, right? And today's athlete, they grew up on technology, and it's just part of the world, and it jives with how they see things. And so incorporating that somehow into what it is that coaches are doing can be a motivating force in it on its own. So lots of different things shared in there today. Like I said, hopefully some of those strategies and those tips you find helpful can infuse them to give the athletes you're working with a boost of motivation. So high fives and take care until next time. Thank you for listening to this recording. I hope you learned something about sports psych, perhaps something you didn't know before, and maybe even something you can apply in your life more generally. If you liked what you heard, feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit my website at fairadvantage.com, or visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify.